What makes us step up? What moves us to go beyond our own lives and commit to something bigger, our communities, our societies, maybe even the world? That's what we're exploring today. And to help unpack it, I'm joined by Professor Sandro Cattacin, a sociologist who has spent years studying what brings people together, what keeps them engaged, and how diversity and cohesion shape democratic societies. This isn't just about policies and theories. It's about us, about the choices we make, the trust we build, and the kind of world we want to live in. Because real change doesn't happen when people just see problems. It happens when they take responsibility for solving them. So if you've ever wondered what it really takes to turn awareness into action, to move from knowing to doing, stick around. Welcome to In Substantia. I'm your host, Gabor Farkas. Here, we explore ideas and challenge assumptions. So let's get started. Welcome, Sandro. Thank you for joining me today. I would like to ask you to introduce yourself so I don't miss anything.
I'm Sandro Cattacin. I am professor in sociology at the University of Geneva. Since I began to work as researcher, I have always tried to work in an interdisciplinary way. So I'm not the classical sociologist, citing only sociologists, but I come from a history with science studies, political philosophy, and economic and social history. My work was always oriented to a question which is related in a certain way to my proper life. It's the question of how you treat people that are marginalized, that they are in vulnerable position. I'm a kid of Italian parents arriving in Switzerland after the Second World War. And I lived first in my life in Zurich and have had to be confronted with xenophobic movements and many anti-Italian initiatives. And so it was relatively clear that this feeling of injustice came up in my life and that it was a mission to work on injustice and how to fight against. And so I worked on migration clearly, but also on HIV/AIDS, drug users, and other situations of vulnerabilities like multiple handicaps, psychical problems, neurodivergencies, etc. So that's a little bit my mission in my life, and I do today, in particular, this kind of research on vulnerability, precariousness in the urban context. So I'm a scholar in urban studies, if you want.
So I suppose the movie Pane e Cioccolate spoke to you.
Yes, Pane e Cioccolato was a very important movie in the history of the movies on migration because it was possible in this movie to underline this continuous ambivalence of the 60s, 50s and 60s between homogenization of the society and claims to have the right to be different. It's a period in which assimilation was the orientation of policies in all fields, not only in the field of migration. So the necessity to adapt all the time to something which was seen as a normality was a trend in not only in Europe, in the continent or in the States, but also on the other side of the political organization of the society, the Soviet sphere. All these functionalistic logics have created many suffering. I think, for instance, regarding homosexuals, they were forbidden in many countries. And concerning migrants, yes, the pressure was to be like the others. And Pane e Cioccolato in this film, you have this scene that Italian worker in Switzerland changes the color of his hair into blonde, and to be seen as an Italian no more. And he goes to see a football match, Italy against Switzerland. And during this football match, he tries to be for the Swiss football team, and at the end, Italy makes a goal, and he is no more able to control his emotions, and he is put out of the restaurant. This is one of these mythical scenes in this film Pane e Cioccolato, which says all the impossibility in a certain way to be another person and what you are without oppression from outside to you in these assimilation policies, but also oppression of yourself, of your identity, which create many psychological problems.
So we're not going to be talking cinema or migration today, although it would be a really interesting theme, so maybe some other time. Today, I thought that it would be interesting, and I have to recognize that was your suggestion, that we talk about civicism and related issues connected to climate change. So there are a lot of expectations coming from activists and politicians on how society has to change, how people have to change their behavior in order for everything that is being done or suggested that has to be done is followed by the population. So we will be talking about civicism and try to see what conditions have to be met in order for people to be civically inclined, to be responsible citizens in the society where they live. We have to go and proceed step by step. And the first question that seems to be evident is, what is civicism and how do you define it in the context of your research?
If we think about the development of our society since 3000 years, we have a period in which people learn that it is better to collaborate, to cooperate in a certain way, than to be one against the other. And this process, in a certain way, to learning to be in a society was analyzed by Norbert Elias, for instance, with the idea of the civilization process. And in this long process of civilization that he has put at the center of his work, he says something very, very clear. You are more and more civilized, more the society is complex. What does it mean? It means that you have to take care about what is going on around you when you are in a complex society, because there is nobody else that can do that. Take care means take care of you, being able to control yourself, not to doing things that are dangerous for the others, but also to observe how the others behave. We can think about an intersection, for instance, in the Middle Age. You know, at this intersection, from time to time, there is a horse going through, or in general, people walking through. But the risk that you die if you don't be too careful with your behavior in this intersection is relatively small. If you think about an intersection today with cars and buses and all this, and even bicycles, you have to be extremely careful in going from one part of the street to the other. You try to learn how people behave, and you try to distinguish what is the right behavior and what is the bad behavior. And you will do that without having a policeman or a policewoman behind you that tell you now you can go on the other part of the street. You have to learn to censor yourself in a certain way, to choose tactics to survive. And this is called civilization. And this civilization process is a very long process, and it's going on more and more. The society is complex, as I said before, because then we have the possibility to find a way to coordinate between us without having the necessity of an oppressive state. This is the other part. Hobbes, for instance, was convinced that we are not able to live together if we don't have something like a strong state observing what we are. Homo homini lupus is his way of analyzing our being, and we are in the Renaissance. We are in this new way of thinking in which there is this divide between the people who think we can be civilized and people that think we are not able to be. I think the history tells us that we can be civilized. And civilization means also coordination through other means like participation, democracy, etc., as an answer to Thomas Hobbes, as an answer to oppressive questions. And I think this is a little bit where we are all the time. What is better that we learn through our behavior to guarantee a free society and to participate to a reproduction of this free society that is good for all people living in this society, or have we to again return to authoritarian experiences that are eliminating people that don't have this capacity to behave in a certain way? If I think about this long history of civilization, we have seen that society that are able to develop civic engagement and responsibilities and respect between people, if I use all these words that goes together, are slowly increasing until the beginning of this century. But that in the last years, democracies are under pressure and are transformed in more authoritarian systems. You see how important is what you are discussing, civism. It's a question about democracy or oppression. And in this logic, we are trying to work with our society when we do research, trying to put the idea forward that perhaps the solution that is better for all of us, that is more respectful for all these people representing differences of all kinds, is to develop civic behavior.
Um, my second question would be, how is civicism studied, and how modern tools have changed the way civicism is studied in modern society?
Civics is studied through clearly the idea that this kind of behavior creates links between people that are a very important resource. An author like Richard Putnam calls these links between people that behave civically social capital. And if you think about social capital, how it is analyzed in the American world of research, you see immediately what is the interest about this resource. It's first of all a very fragile resource. It needs trust in a society. And so you analyze clearly how links between people, relations between people create trust, and how is the level of trust in societies. And then you have very interesting dynamics and relations that you can put forward. Typically, the higher social capital is in a society, the more good governance you have. This is a famous book of Richard Putnam called Making Democracy Work. And in this book, he analyzed different regions and measures in a certain way the links between the people, how many relations exist, what kind of relations. And one indicator is the number of civic engagement and the presence of associations and volunteering. So if you have many people engaging in a volunteer way, you have normally better governance. What is interesting is that other authors linked to this kind of analysis also the idea that it could be important tool for economic performance. And also like Arnaldo Bagnasco was very clear on that. It's a stable economy that you have if you have a high social capital. He doesn't go in the direction to say that economies are stronger if there is a high level of social capital. No, he says if there is a high level of social capital, in times of crisis, they are better to react. They are able to stabilize situation of crisis on a better level than other parts with less social capital. But say that the link between social capital and circular economy, like we are talking today about the new models to do economy in the cities, in the urban context, the link between these two kinds of thinking, it's very near. So better governance, stabilized economy are consequences of a high level of social capital, a high level of trust in the society, which is based clearly on civic behavior. That's perhaps the first part of measuring this kind of capital, of fragile capital. Also, if it goes down, you have the consequences immediately on a bad economy and on bad governance, clientelism, corruption, etc. Increases if there is enormously mistrust between people. That's the first part of the answer on the measures. I think there is a second part in which you can go in the direction to say, okay, civic engagement can also be measured through a way of trusting institutions in general. So you measure the trust in the official institutions, and you realize that societies in which there is a higher trust in institutions need less control or police, which could have interesting policy consequences. For instance, if you think about this period of the fight against COVID, you have on the one side countries with very liberal choices during this period, like Switzerland or Sweden, and countries with very restrictive logics, like Italy or France. And what is interesting is the question, what was the better policy, the restrictive or the liberal one? And research has tried to link the answers in terms of dying people, in terms of problems in the organization of the society during the COVID period, with this trust in the institutions. And they find out something very surprising, that there is not the best policy to fight against COVID, but you have to adapt to the situation in which people are living regarding trust to institutions. In other words, if the trust is high, if people are civically present in the society, are normally helping between them, are normally hearing what the state says is to do or not to do, you don't need so restrictive policies. You can have a liberal model. If you have a strong difference between trust in institutions and people behavior, you have to have more restrictive policies. And so typically the Swiss or the Swedish policies in Italy would have created dramatic situations. And you have the example that demonstrate that, which are the United States and which are Brazil. Bolsonaro and Trump during the COVID period decided to have a liberal approach, which had consequences on the death rate of these countries. And so you see, constructing trust means having more personal freedom. Having a society in which the social capital is high means having clearly more possibility to do things that are in your own interest. If I try to put this kind of thinking again in something like a view of social and political theory, we can talk a little moment, but really only 2 minutes, about Adam Smith's paradox. You know that Adam Smith has written a very important book, The Wealth of Nations, in which he says something at first glance very strange. Don't trust nobody. Do only things that are useful for you. He thinks and he tries to demonstrate that a society which is egoistic and individualistic in the way entrepreneurship is done will create the perfect market thanks to this invisible hand. And what many people doesn't know is that he has written 30 years before The Wealth of Nations his book about the moral sentiments in a society. And you think, why the ideologist of the free market is writing a book before about moral sentiments? And in fact, the paradox that we have is a book in which it says empathy, he talks about sympathy, is fundamental in the society. And the other who says, the other book, don't think to what you can do in good ways for other people. Think only about your proper interests. This is called Adam Smith paradox, and it's trying to be solved since years. But in economic history today, there is something like an agreement that through the letters that Smith writes to contemporary philosophers in this period, it comes out that he's in a certain way thinking that there is something like a good moral in all people. But if it is also in the society, then the society can construct on this basic trust between people a very competitive, concurrence-oriented economy. So you have something like the strong part which is necessary of a society based on sympathy, to use the wording of Adam Smith, we would say today empathy or social capital, and a strong economy. This would be a way to read Adam Smith paradox that is in this moment more or less the most diffused. There are other people who say Adam Smith has written 2 books and has no thought about the relation between them, but this is not the interpretation.
Well, there are a lot of things to unpack in what you just said. The fact that Adam Smith wrote the 2 books 30 years apart might be also a reflection on how the way we look at society changes with time. And it's not an uncommon path for youngsters who are very social minded to become more liberal and think more about themselves. So that could also be a way of looking at it. I was wondering what kind of impact heterogeneity in society plays on civicism. Yeah, we can look at heterogeneity from different aspects. So, what role does this play when we see the emergence of partisanship in the political discourse and in also the way different groups confront each other?
Yeah, that's a key question, I would say. If we want organized change in the society, if I cannot say that homogeneity is a problem to influence society, but could be used in a very ideal way, Swedish society was until recently. It was very easy in Sweden to make a message that in this trustful relation between the state and population was followed by a large part of the people living in Sweden. That's certainly important. The question is clearly, is heterogeneity creating disengagement? And that's perhaps a bad conclusion if we think in a logical way these 2 conditions. We have first a clear relation between heterogeneity and creativity, capacity to innovate, capacity to solve in another way societal questions. And the more a society is homogeneous, the less the society is able to produce from the proper resources innovation. This is a clear, is one of the strengths that explains why the after World War period was not so particularly innovative or creative, because all was really put in the idea we have to be all middle class, to have the same behavior, to live in the same way. So this pressure to homogeneity was also the beginning of the end of an economic model. The model that came after this period of homogeneity, pressure of oppression of differences, if you want, was the period of flexibilized economy of flexibilism, which is based on the idea that heterogeneity produces innovation through the confrontation of different views on the same problems. You create easily a third view, which is better than the 2 different views. But you cannot do if all people think the same, if all people have their own values. So heterogeneity is in a certain way fundamental for the advancement of the society. And it's more present in the urban context today, which means that the urban context is the place in which innovation and creativity is situated. We have good data for this kind of hypothesis. today have also published recently a book, Ville et Créativité, with a series of articles analyzing different aspects of this relation between heterogeneity and creativity. But now the real question is, if you have a heterogeneous society, have we more conflicts, which is something that today in the political discourse is often put forward as a hypothesis. If I think about the Italian government asking to return to three fundamental values, just the family, the tradition, and the nation, then you see that the idea is that all problems comes from heterogeneity. But in fact, if you kill heterogeneity, you kill the country, you kill the cities, you kill the economy, you exclude people, you oppress people that think differently. And if we begin then to say, but how is heterogeneity reproducing a society? We realize something typically urban, that if you meet people that are different, you are able to take a reflexive position on your values. In other words, you are saying that you can distinguish your values from other values and indicating that your proper values are your subjective values. And you can respect and you learn to respect the other because you meet them every day in the buses, on the streets. So if you see that the way to be more constructive, more pragmatic, more able to speak to differences is related to continuous contacts between people, the famous contact theory of Newport, 1951, he has written this book that has created thousands of research of reproduction of this theory, and it was always said, yes, that's the theory that we have to follow. You can say that a society in which you have many possibilities to meet people that are different is a society in which you develop more respect for these differences, more attention of what is your sphere, your world, your identity, and what is the other one. The contact theory says nothing more, but it means then for us that we have to be very careful on planning of cities, having place of encounters, having parks, neighborhood parks are so important. Creating a society in which meeting other people spontaneously is easy. And that's typically something you have more in the urban context than in the peripheries or on the countryside. If I want to cite a specific research that demonstrates this relation, it's very easy. You can go through all the surveys on racism, on xenophobia, on misanthropy, and you will find out that the more urban a place is, the less people are sexist, Islamophobic, xenophobic, racist, etc. And the less people meet people that are different, the more this kind of attitudes increases. In Switzerland, for instance, anti-Semitic attitudes are the highest in the canton of Tessin, which is the canton with the lowest number of people with Jewish origins. And this is typically a kind of dynamic we can link to heterogeneity. So heterogeneity is harder to live, but it creates a better society. It creates a society in which respect is installed.
Heterogeneity plays a factor, but it's leveling things out because people work together and share common spaces. What are the main socio-economic factors that influence the level of civicism in a population? Because that doesn't level out.
Yeah, there is surprising results also research on the socioeconomic level. You have homogenic socioeconomic levels create more interdependence and helping dynamics. We have again see that in poor neighborhoods during the COVID period, self-help and helping the other and helping the neighbor was a normal behavior of the people and not something which was strange. And so the problem is often if you have mistrust, that means no contact between differences socioeconomically too, then you develop less self-help initiatives, less initiatives related to create a better community. Well, we know that cities and urban contexts are extremely problematic from this point of view because people is mobile and changes continuously, and think that there are individuals that you can identify as constructors of social capital, social entrepreneurs in a certain way. It could be people that take care of a building, for instance, that live in the building and are very careful on trying to see what are doing the people living there. There could be associations that invest in the neighborhood as a place of living together and invest in commons in the neighborhood. These commons are the neighborhood parks, small parks in which you can go, you can do what you like to do. You develop a behavior of civism there because you're not alone in these parks. But it's important that something are behind to take care about these places. So you cannot leave it to all people, but you need something like a social dynamic which is installed and which is driven forward by some of these social entrepreneurs we have in all neighborhoods when they are good neighborhoods, but we don't have it in neighborhoods when they have problems and create implosion. So the socio-economic element is a problem for formal organizing of volunteering in associations, we know that. But the informal volunteering is very high in these neighborhoods with low class people living there, for instance, or with a low socioeconomic status. It can be changed through mixing up a little bit, trying to find people which is more middle class oriented. We know that middle class is very engaged always in associations and in organizing commons. But that doesn't mean that the others are not engaged, but simply not in these formal ways because they have simply no time. They have to work and to survive in a more tactical logic than in this strategic way. I want to have a nice neighborhood.
I seem to remember that when I was growing up in school, we had civic education classes. And my kids, I don't think they had that. How can education and awareness campaigns strengthen civicism? And why aren't we having civicism classes in schools now?
In different moments and in different ways, schools work on this question. That's clear. It's no more the hour on civic behavior or civism that is today, but you have something like a special week on migration and problems related to migration, a special week on direct democracy, etc., etc. They are simply organized more in a participative logic, which is for the pedagogical output better than it was before. So civism is thought, and I think we have this important role of schools to teach the value of democracy in a way or in another. But what is certainly else important that we find ways, again, more participative ways to teach and to educate in the direction of responsibility for a very, very challenged world from the point of view of this dramatic climate change and the challenges which going together. So typically, if you do in the same time, you learn in the same time how to work in your garden, and you develop where you live urban gardening. You have the two elements. Urban gardening needs civic behavior because it's not your garden, but it's a garden of a community. Knowing how to do combines this behavior with, I would say, not ecological thinking, but something like a respect for the nature. And this is the kind of passage we have to help to organize in the next years through the schools. And they are doing largely this kind of work without really knowing that they are doing. But I think it could be better systematized, and it could be a very fundamental and always present element in all disciplines so that the schools that we need in a certain way, something we can call a deep learning for what could be a better society and a society that survives facing climate change.
How do cultural values and social norms impact civicism?
if you ask people what their values are, you receive very strange answers today because we live in a complex society with complex ways of living, and we know that these values are more fragile than before. So you receive answers that can be surprising too. But if you ask what are the values that we have to put forward for the whole society, if you ask not the individual moral, but the collective moral that we have to develop, you will be again surprised that there is a high conscience about the importance of democracy, for instance, a high conscience about the fact that we have to find ways to living together that are that confront us with this question of sustainability of our ways of living. Now, if this is there, if we have this large bunch of people thinking, I would say, like Kant would say, for what is the well being of the others and of the collectivity, there are something like universal judges. They know what is good for the society. Many of them know what is good of the society. What we fail in this moment is to bring that together to something like a political project, like a view of tomorrow which is pleasant for the people. Politics in this moment confront these values, these collective values, if we want to use this word, talking about not the individual, but the value for the others. Politicians confronted to this kind of population says, on the one side, oh, these problems doesn't exist. That's the first way of doing of many parties and politicians saying we don't have climate change. They are less and less important, I would say, in this moment, but they exist and continue to exist. Then we had the other ones who are in this dramatic way of talking about the society and saying we have to reduce our way of consumption, our way of living, reducing and restricting our life and our life choices. And I would say what is lacking in this moment is something like a third discourse that says, okay, it could be a nice society if we are more careful with the nature, in which you will feel better than now. And I think we have now to work on this third way of thinking the future, not as something of a problem that will be completely changing what are our habits, but something like a chance that will change some of our behaviors, but it will simplify many elements related to our life. I will make an example which we have tested during the COVID period, the home working experience. I'll talk about that for a second. The home working experience was clearly related to the fact to diminish the contacts between the people, but it was also an experience of using less public transports and individual transports, cars in particular. So the cities were very nice in this period without less cars in the cities, less noise in the cities. And so you have had this double experience that not going to work, reducing mobility creates well being for many people. And so I think we have today to work on this kind of narrative that saying that to work at home once a day has an enormous impact on the ecological side, on the living condition in the cities. Or rediscovering the neighborhood through working at home has created in many people something like a surprise moment, like they find that there are parks in their neighborhood. They find out that there are services in their neighborhood they never used because they have always used the services near to the working place and slept only at home. So I think that's typically a way of combining ecological questions with questions related to the well-being and would say the work on the self and the self as a person that want to be better tomorrow and not worse here in the living conditions, not having to renounce many things you like. Another element always related to COVID, and I think COVID is in this sense really an accelerator for ecological questionings we have to take into consideration in the future, was the mobility itself. So typically, don't use the car, that was a clear message, but also don't use too much the public transportation. And people was in a certain way incitated to use bicycles, to use their own feet, which means that you need bicycle lanes and that you need larger places for the people walking through the city, or even places that are completely pedestrian. Again, bicycle and walking are elements that reduce the impact that we have on the society from an ecological point of view and increases the well-being. You feel better if you do a little bit sport, if you walk a little bit. You are better in your body.
Well, it's interesting when you say that there is a big gap between what individuals will say is important for them, the values that are important for them, and the values that they think should be important for society, and how it appears to be difficult for some or many of us to adhere to the values that are important for society, but demand that the values important for us be respected. Maybe we can ask if there are significant cultural differences in levels of civicism around the world that is impacted by this discrepancy.
Yeah, I don't like cultural explanations. As I told you at the beginning, Italian, born in Switzerland, and always confronted with people that told me Italians are like that. That's cultural. And I have always experienced that as a critique and not as something which valorized to my life. And in fact, I had difficulties to imagine something like an Italian culture. I don't know what an Italian culture is. Like, I don't know what an American, North American, or South American, or African culture would be. There's so many differences, and we are not a museum. We are people, and we can change. We can choose to eat not only spaghetti, but also other meats. And for instance, I'm vegetarian, and yeah, that's why have I to explain that with cultural elements? There are many indicators for having higher civism and higher social capital if you want in a society. First is heterogeneity. If you have a strong heterogeneity in the population, no group that can say to another group what they have to do. So high heterogeneity and high symmetry of power, which is a description of a good democracy. That means you don't have very rich people that are able to decide about a neighborhood, what you have to build in this neighborhood, etc. So if you have heterogeneity and symmetry together, it's normally easier to involve people in civic activities, to involve people in activities like taking garbage out of the river and things like that, or working on the commons we have in our environment, like the park, or like really the green and the blue spaces, but also inside the buildings. During the COVID, for instance, you have in places like Geneva, you have had people that have written their telephone number on the elevator. If you need help, call me. Or put books on the entry part, take the book if you want to read my books, it's a free library and things like that. So you have all this kind of behavior, but that means that the other way around, high discrepancies between poor and rich people, so high asymmetry in power, authoritarian systems in which you don't have trust in institutions because they use their power regularly against you. In this context, you develop, for instance, familialism. You have a high solidarity inside your family, but what is outside is the enemy. So these are criteria that we can influence, so we can fight against authoritarianism. We can create systems in which the distribution of richness is fair. It has not to be communism. It's not that what I mean. It has to be fair that people that have more money can demonstrate that they deserve this more money. So we have many elements that are basic elements politics and politicians can influence if they want to have more civicness, civic behavior. So it's not only a question of the work on an individual. If you want to have a society able to confront climate change with democracy, then we need a fair society. And there are many instruments to realize that.
You raised the question of trust, and studies have shown that trust in political systems is dwindling, as is trust in journalists. So scientists were able to keep high levels of trust, but it seems that COVID has also impacted that. Let's maybe ask, how does the trust in governmental institution affect civism?
This trust level is related to social capital, so it's not coming from the institutions itself. It's coming through democracy and participation. And I think that's an important point that you touch with your question that we have perhaps not discussed until now. Societies that have to be able to confront these challenges, like the COVID was an enormous challenge, are societies that we have to include more in the production of solutions. During the COVID period, we have had really a very long technocratic period in which science decided what people have to do. And as we know, science is not a good place for decision. We can help to give indicators, we can help to give some hints what science is saying about problems you have, but we are not scientific people, are not politicians. And during the COVID period, it was a little bit changed. And I think this has created enormously mistrust. We know from the 50s and 60s, this technocratic period was the beginning of all social movements against politics, because you cannot do decisions without participation. And if you participate, and in this participative moments, you play well together between ideologies, values, philosophies on the one side, and scientific questions that you can mobilize for your discussions, then the results are normally more pragmatic, more inclusive regarding a specific territory. We insist on this participation today, and we know that there are many people that feel not to be included or heard by politicians, which means that probably the classical participation path from the democracy is not sufficient. So you cannot only vote and elect. It's not sufficient to create a large feeling of being heard in the population. Many countries and many territories have today participation rates which are 50% and less, not only in Switzerland, but also in many countries around Switzerland. So that means nothing else that we are doing perhaps not so a good work in including people. And all this thinking of complotism, etc., arrives in these groups which are not included in this world. We want to find solutions together. And for that, I think we have to go nearer to the people. We have to go nearer to their interests and to their way of seeing and living. One of these possibilities is to have decentralized democracy, stronger decentralized democracy, having participative instruments for budgeting on the decentralized levels, asking people what they think also with very basic instruments like neighborhood infrastructures for all, in which you can go if you have a problem and talk about that, and having somebody that hears to you and doesn't say, yes, that's really bad what you feel, what you have as a problem, and so is the world, that's politics. They do only things that serves themselves. So You go in these places, you tell your problems, and there's somebody there who says, okay, I will try to find a solution. I will discuss with the politicians, and you will have a feedback about what we'll do or what we can do. And this kind of going again in the direction of the people, particularly the more excluded ones, the more marginalized ones, I think could be the best way to recreate something like the feeling of trust in institutions.
I think the key word in what you just said is feedback, because there is this intention to open up agoras and conversation spaces where the population will go and share their thought and speak. The problem is the lack of feedback once this has happened. You don't know what they do with your ideas, what your suggestions. And it's when you do that a few times and you don't get any feedback and you don't see any changes, you question the validity of the whole process. Does it make any sense? Or are they just here to keep the population quiet? And that's why they've opened up these spaces.
It seems that once upon a time there was this thing we called the fourth power, and by this I mean the press.
The way society has transformed with new technology, the role of the press evolved quite considerably.
Now we should be talking of news channels,
Because we cannot just talk about press. It's not just the printing press, it's TV and radio. So we can also wonder how the trust the people have in the way they access information
impacts their civic behavior.
and how does access to information and media influence that?
I think that the public space is fundamental for democracies, not because it's the fourth power, but it's the place in which this communicative power, to cite Hannah Arendt, is produced. Communicative power is the first step to the institutionalization of change. And if you have a public debate in which one says this and the other says that, and at the end they find a way to go forward together with something like a public discussed consensus, then institutions can write easily laws. And we have a real problem today with not so functional public space. We have many autonomous public spaces related to groups which don't discuss together. We have possibilities to influence and discussions. You can even pay people to intervene in the American elections, which are even not people but bots, automatic interventions if somebody says something. So many elements that are destroying this fundamental space for creating, again, communicative power, if you want, the basis for decision making through confrontation of arguments. That's what is going on, what has to go on in this public space. We don't have alternatives to that. We cannot say, okay, discussion is only parliament. No, parliament that is elected is a parliament that needs this space to decide well and to decide in a way that people follows and not change every time. It's a question of regulation of this space, which is today, I think, very important, arriving to have more possibility of control, more rules of control this space to create at least from time to time open discussions with arguments without instrumental influences from other countries on your countries, from specific groups on your discussion that have economic interests or are oriented to introduce authoritarian systems to improve their power position. So it's a very fragile space today. And the rules to manage this space are too weak. And I'm very aware about the fact that if this space is no more doing the work this space have to do, we will have problems to continue with our very fragile democratic system too.
We have looked at the hurdles that stand in the way of civicism,
The necessity of
having the population contribute to the global effort of having a nice environment and doing the changes that are necessary. Maybe we can look at the positive and see what works. Can you give us concrete examples of programs or initiatives that have successfully strengthened civicism?
There are many, and they are always also very fragile or very not institutionalized as elements that could be generalized on a space. So we are experimenting many ways of creating civism. One example could be here in Geneva. For instance, the neighborhood contracts. It's an instrument that is in the hands of the local governments, and it permits to give small amount of monies to initiatives coming from bottom up. You present a project, you ask some money to realize it, and you have only to demonstrate that it is useful for your neighborhood, this project, that it improves the well-being not only of you, but also of the collectivity in this neighborhood. And these instruments were developed perhaps 15 years ago. In some neighborhoods, they are very well used, in other less well. And the difference between the one that use these instruments and the one they don't use it is normally the difficulty to ask people to write a project. It's a competence in a project. And so they began to institutionalize in these more poorer neighborhoods, places with social assistance in particular, that helps people to write a project, or even to transform this demand for financing in a oral presentation. Somebody who is from Spanish origin, for instance, with difficulties to write in French, can go to a place once a month and tell them that the person has a project, how to improve, for instance, the way to reach old people living in this neighborhood and that comes not out of the house, for instance. And so the public presentation in a small commission is sufficient to receive these amounts and to realize initiatives. That's an example and way saying, for instance, I will in the next 10 years, in particular, help projects that are more oriented to sustainability. And so you can influence initiatives coming up from bottom up to transform neighborhoods. You can say that the most important element to develop being and civic behavior in neighborhoods is the feeling of belonging. Again, we have now initiatives that tries to make that people feel better in the place they are living, in particular in peripheries, bringing in these places cultural initiatives, theater representation, concerts in the park, to say to these people, yeah, we don't have forgot you. We bring art to you. They don't want only art. That's clear. They want also a small shop to can buy things which are near to the place they are living. They need also parks that are usable. So you can, in a certain way, bringing urban quality in the peripheries to have in these places in which you have the highest concentration of people that don't participate, people that follows complotistic theories. If you bring urban elements in these places, they feel recognized, they have possibilities of encounters with others to discuss, and they change their way of thinking. And that's not something which I say like that. There are examples in which you can really, in a perspective of 5 to 10 years, transform a bad neighborhood in a neighborhood in which you feel a high quality of life or a good quality of life, which means belonging, which means civic behavior. That's, for instance, the neighborhood of Schwammendingen near to Zurich. It was a very bad neighborhood. Today, it's a neighborhood in which people want to go to live. So an important change without gentrification, simply bringing services in this place.
So that seems to be a policy that has worked. Are there any case studies where other specific policies have had a significant impact on civicism? I'm
Yes.
thinking of one that had a tremendous impact in Medellin, for instance.
Yeah,
Because
Medellin.
I was in Medellin. Everybody knows about the drug cartels and Pablo Escobar, and how impactful it was in a negative way on the city, and how it has turned around with different initiatives.
Hmm. So Medellin is a good example, and I've had a student who worked on these neighborhoods, and I was very impressed about her experiences there in this period in which criminality was very strong. But yeah, we can really have many examples. Again, I think what is lacking in this moment are examples in which you work on these two elements together as sustainable behavior and democracy. Bringing these two things together, I think, is very important. Clearly, you can say if you feel well in your neighborhood, you feel well where you are living, there are good chances to take you also on this path to more sustainable behavior, to go to car sharing, to organize your life in a way that your mobility is reduced and your impact is reduced, etc., etc. So all these international examples, like the example of Medellin, in which they make a station of the urban transport system in the middle of a favela, and that is sprawled out services and sprawled out quality in a certain way, which is a typical urban quality in a favela, was extremely important. But entering in these places and being in these places and thinking about sustainability means many other elements, means recycling, water quality, etc. And in particular, if I think about the heat problem we have, constructions that are able to give to the people a chance of survival, not today, but in 5, 10, 15 years, we will have all to fight and to find ways of survival in a very hot society during the summer period. The other way of thinking, I think you have some elements in cooperative experiments in which you choose in a certain way, you select in a certain way people that want to experiment a way without car, a life without consumption of products that are produced and overusing energy. So you can imagine gardening spaces and car-free spaces, or having some cars. If you know that you need 3 cars for 50 people, more or less, it means really we can change without having to think about no more using a car. You have something in between which is easy to realize, but that means many other things. Trying to make experiments is important. We have such experiments in Australia. There are nice experiments in using typically also marginalized groups like undocumented migrants, giving them the chance to live in a place and to construct in this place something like other living conditions. They are extremely grateful. They are very motivated to do well. So you have in this more marginalized group often also very engaged groups to do well the things. You have cooperatives in cities that are realizing this new way of living together. But I think what is important that we have to not only to do that, but to communicate that. So to have good marketing around these initiatives and telling to the other peoples, see, you will have a better life if you will be in this kind of living conditions than in the living conditions you are now, and we will open more and more the city to these experiments that will be no more an experiment in some years, but the normality. That's, I think, what we have to work on.
Regrettably, what emerges from this conversation is that there is no magic formula. Everybody has to put in some goodwill in order to reach the set objective important for everybody, because it's our well-being that depends on that.
I think really I will really say again quickly to make a little bit the link between what I said before. Um, it's not really a question if people will be willing to change or if they can change, but it's really a question between democracy and authoritarianism. So or the world will no more exist, or we will try to do it in freedom, this change, and give an answer to this change, or we will have systems that will oblige us. And I think this alternative is an alternative that we never discuss in this radicality, but we have to think in this, to think it in this radicality.
Yes, that's something that we have to keep in mind. We either do that voluntarily, or at one point, systems will impose changes on us, whether we want it or not. And they'll be restrictive and dictatorial in that sense. You have to keep that in mind. So thank you for your time. Before concluding, I would like to ask you a question. What is it that we are not talking about, but we should be?
There are many topics I think we have to talk about. We should talk about. We are in a challenging moment, not only concerning the future, but concerning fundamental elements of living and surviving together. We have a war situation in Europe and near to Europe that risks to be transformed in a world war situation. That's something we have to talk about. We have this dramatic orientation to migration as a problem, when it would be more intelligent to see migration as a chance and a resource. So again, an important topic that is an important topic for us all. We have enormous discrepancies between people that have power and richness and poor people in this world. Again, this question of the just society is a question of a non-discriminating society, non-discriminating Afro-descendant people, not discriminating women, not discriminating people that have characteristics that risks to be transformed in discriminations. And last, but again, not least, the environmental challenge. We discuss it, but I feel like we are not able to see how serious is the situation. If you put together these four enormous challenges and you think about tomorrow, and perhaps you are 20 years old, not like me, then it's very hard to survive and to project in the future. So we are now destroying the future of this young new generation by not taking care seriously on these four important topics.
Yes. Well, maybe we have to hope that we are putting down the brakes for the coming generation to be wiser. Hopefully they will become wiser because they can, not because they have to. Thank you very much for the time that we had, and maybe we will be able to talk about a different topic on another occasion. Thank you, Sandro.
Thank you for this nice talk.